With Donald Trump wavering over NATO, is President Erdogan of Turkey the figure who's holding the alliance together? Turkey's hosting the NATO summit this week. Donald Trump is there, but it sounds like it was touch and go.
I mean, I wouldn't have gone for, what we went through over the last 2 months with, the various countries.
The US president says there's one leader who still has sway with him on this topic.
I would have not gone for most people, but he called me up. He said, please, I have it in Turkey. You got to be there. The United States has to be there. And so I'm going out of respect to President Erdogan.
Erdogan's a friend of Trump and a leader who's committed to NATO. But who is Turkey's all-powerful president? And could he be NATO's last hope? From the BBC, I'm Tristan Redman in London. Welcome to The Global Story on YouTube. Mark Lowen is a presenter and correspondent for the BBC, and he was the BBC's man in Istanbul in Turkey between 2014 and 2019. He joined me here in our London studio, and I started by asking him why it's so significant that Donald Trump is attending the NATO summit in Turkey this year.
I think that Donald Trump's antipathy towards NATO is no secret. And real questions over the US commitment to the alliance. And Donald Trump likes sort of massaging the ego of world leaders who he likes and who he feels close to. And I think he's cottoned on to the fact that Recep Tayyip Erdogan has a very difficult relationship with a lot of Western leaders. He's been long criticised, and we'll get into this, for backsliding on democracy, human rights abuses, growing authoritarianism, and Donald Trump doesn't have any time really for leaders who kind of worry about that. He likes leaders who are punchy, this sort of strongman leadership. He admires Putin and Kim Jong-un. And Erdogan absolutely in that camp.
The NATO summit happening in Turkey, it's the first time since the early 2000s that it's been there. Turkey is a pretty committed NATO member and is strategically a pivotal country in the alliance. But what's the history of that? Why is Turkey so committed to NATO?
Turkey joined in 1952, 3 years after NATO was founded. And its admission was seen as a badge of Turkey's pro-Western political alignment. And so, Turkey, this country which is in the Middle East, but also in Europe, very largely Islamic and increasingly so, the fact that it was kind of part of the Western club of nations was a real huge feather in its cap. And now today it's got the second largest army in NATO. And, in such a fiery neighborhood bordering Iran and Syria and, at the crossroads of so many complex geopolitical problems, it is a really essential country for NATO. But, Erdogan has used that as leverage so much with Western leaders because he knows that, he can get all the criticism he likes, but Turkey is the pillar of NATO security in the East.
Well, we're going to move on in a second to the relationship between Erdogan and Trump. But before we do that, we want to get a little bit of a sense of who Erdogan is within Turkey. So you lived in Turkey for 5 years in the 20-teens while Erdogan was president. And then you went back last year in 2025 to cover a protest movement against Erdogan. And you were arrested as part of your coverage of the crackdown on those protests. What actually happened, Mark?
I had been the correspondent there until 2019, and Turkey's very much kind of in my blood. Even after I left, I still have continued to watch it closely and monitor it closely and feel very kind of close to the story in many ways. And so I was sent back to cover the aftermath of the arrest of the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, who I interviewed when he won the election as mayor of Istanbul, which was a huge deal because Istanbul it's not the capital, but it is the most important city in Turkey. It's the biggest city. I mean, at least 15 million people, probably much more. And also, it happens to be the city that a certain Recep Tayyip Erdogan was mayor of in the 90s, and he once said, "Whoever wins Istanbul wins Turkey." So that showed how important İmamoğlu's victory was. The governing AK party disputed it, went to a recount, then he won a rerun basically. He won in a bigger way, so it was a huge slap in the face for the AKP. So İmamoğlu has been seen as the biggest political opponent of Erdogan. So last year he was suddenly arrested and jailed on various different charges, including alleged corruption. His university decree was revoked, and you can't be a president of Turkey unless you have been to university. So his supporters saw it as a absolutely brazen attempt to stifle the opposition and to basically get rid of the biggest threat to Erdogan in his political career. The government says that's not the case, and the judiciary is independent. So it sparked massive protests. Now, I've covered a lot of protests in my time in Turkey, but I was sent back because it looked like it was really building steam. And we covered it for a 2-3 days, in a very sort of straight up and down way.
We saw a large protest by students rallying in the centre of Istanbul earlier today. They believe they've got the energy to sustain this protest. The question is whether they have and whether it can grow over the days and weeks to come.
And then suddenly I was in my hotel room on maybe day 3 or something, and the phone rang in my hotel room. And this chap said, "Mr. Lowen, it's reception. Can you come down? There's an important thing we'd like to talk to you about." And I said, "Well, can we not talk about it on the phone?" And he said, "No, please come down." So I came down, and there were 3 plainclothes policemen in reception waiting for me. And they said, "Get your passport," and they whisked me off. And that then began 17 hours in detention in 3 different places. And they told me in the middle of the night that I was deemed a threat to public order, and I was being deported. And I was put on an 8 a.m. flight to London.
Is it true that you're still banned from going to Turkey?
I am until 2030, which is, it was a 5-year ban, unless, of course, there's a political change.
I'm sorry to hear that. How does that feel?
It's frustrating. I mean, I'd quite like to go there as a tourist and take my children there. I love the country, and it's just really sad that I sort of felt like my Turkish adventure had ended in that way.
What does all this say about the wider context of democracy and free speech and journalism within Turkey?
It says what we knew for a long time, which is that free speech and freedom of the press no longer exists in Turkey. It is estimated that around 90% of the media in Turkey is either under the control of the government, or of kind of people very close to President Erdogan. I mean, just in the run-up to this NATO summit, dozens of journalists who were deemed to be independent or critical were denied accreditation to the NATO summit, which was a kind of awkward thing for NATO itself to deal with. NATO said, well, it's the host country that deals with press accreditation. But I mean, journalists are routinely harassed and oppressed, and some of them locked. I mean, when I lived there, Turkey was the biggest jailer of journalists in the world. But independent journalism exists, but it has very little room for maneuver. But I think what it also shows, Tristan, is that that President Erdogan and the government have become increasingly confident in what they can do and what they can kind of get away with, I suppose.
Well, Erdogan's been around for a good while. Has it always been like this?
If you speak to his opponents, some of them will say yes, but he hid it, and that we all knew he was going to be like this. But some of those opponents, there's a kind of tinge of sort of, I would say, Islamophobia to that, because the big dividing line in Turkey is and has always been, I think, over Islam and over religion in political office. And the staunch secularists say, the Islamists are always like this. They always they look as though they're going to be fine, and then they clamp down on democracy. I don't know whether I buy that argument. I mean, he came through Islamist politics, and then he became mayor of Istanbul in this shock result. And he was a really good mayor of Istanbul in many ways. He cleaned up the city, collected the rubbish, etc., etc. And he was initially seen by the West as a man they could do business with. It was said that Barack Obama called Erdogan on the phone more often than any other world leader, apart from David Cameron, the British Prime Minister at the time. He was the leader who took Turkey towards EU accession. He was the man who finally emasculated the military, who were for decades the kind of driving force in Turkish politics and would routinely come in and just take over when political Islam was getting a bit too powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So those were all seen as really important signs of democratization. But then came the increasing crackdown, and that is where critics of him will say signs of that were already emerging much earlier.
The next thing that happens in our story, though, is the attempted coup against Erdogan in 2016, which many of us remember. Why was that such a crucial turning point?
I have to go a little bit back, which is that there was this chap who died recently called Fethullah Gulen, who was a Turkish preacher who used to be very closely allied with Erdogan. In fact, Gulen helped Erdogan get to power, basically. And Gulen's followers were in all the kind of elite universities in Turkey and a lot of institutions and things, and they really kind of helped lay the groundwork for political Islam to come into office. And so they were allies. But then Gulen began to turn on Erdogan, and there were all these kind of recordings that emerged, tapped recordings of Erdogan and his followers allegedly discussing deeply corrupt deals. And Erdogan, the great political survivor that he is, managed to turn this whole thing on its head and say, this is illegal, this is the parallel state, as he called it, and it is all the fault of this menace, Gulen and his followers. So they were all suddenly became not just persona non grata, but they were labeled terrorists. And the term Gulenist was just bandied around to everybody, not just people who were actually Gulen followers, and absolutely there were, and there was a sort of, if not parallel state, there were many people working for this guy in institutions, but people who sent their children to Gulen schools and who were fairly, had nothing to do with him, were suddenly labeled terrorists and forced out of the country. I was often called a Gulenist by government people, so it was a real kind of easy term to use. So then, fast forward to July 2016, suddenly, for the first time since the 1990s, tanks started rolling into Istanbul, crossing the Bosphorus Bridge and running over people and firing. And, there were planes that were commandeered and, bombed parliament in Ankara. It was absolutely shocking. I mean, I've got sort of almost shivers going down my spine talking about it because it's a long time since I have talked about it. And, thinking back that we lived through this, it was just extraordinary. And this was an attempted coup. And they tried to kill Erdogan as well. It absolutely stunned the country and shook it to its core, and it failed quickly. I mean, he's a very wily guy. He took his phone, or he was given a phone by a reporter, and he recorded a selfie video at the airport saying, "Come out and defeat this." It was a call to arms in the social media world, and people did it. And largely his supporters did it, but also people actually who were like, we don't really want the military to run our country anymore, did it. And there was this mass mobilization, and it was extraordinary. And the government paints this as the victory for democracy. Of course, what happened afterwards was that the government then launched a massive purge of hundreds of thousands of anybody who they thought was linked to Gulen, jailing, chasing people out of the country.
So Erdogan uses it as an opportunity to consolidate his power.
He called it a gift from God.
Okay. Well, shortly after, Donald Trump is elected, another one of these pivotal moments that happens in 2016. And very quickly, Trump and Erdogan established quite a strong bond. But what was that bond based on?
It was based, I think, as I said, on kind of, their personalities sort of aligning. They're also very transactional presidents. They like to do deals. And, for Erdogan, he wanted things from Trump. Particularly, he wanted to be kind of given the time of day actually by a US president, because the Biden administration, between the two Trump terms, snubbed Erdogan largely. Obama fell out with Erdogan over Erdogan's backsliding on democracy. So a lot of Erdogan is about wanting to be respected on the world stage, and Trump respected him because he's the kind of leader who Trump does respect. But I have to say, Tristan, they had close alliance from 2016, but they also rubbed up against each other a little bit because after the coup, one of those who was jailed was an American pastor, a guy called Andrew Brunson. And he was held in jail for about 2 years in Turkey. The government accused Pastor Brunson of being a terrorist. That's, of course, something that was completely denied by Brunson and his followers and the American government, who were just absolutely determined to get him out. So Trump slapped tariffs on Turkey quite early, which led to massive inflation, the Turkish lira absolutely sinking. This was 2018, I think. But then, Trump and Erdogan being Trump and Erdogan, they kind of kissed and made up, and now they're very close. Because, Brunson was let out of jail and went back to America, got an audience at the White House, despite the fact that, Erdogan saying the judiciary is independent. A pressure from Trump does it.
So I'd forgotten about the pastor, but I do remember from Trump's first term that this kind of moment of tension over a Turkish weapons deal that was struck with Russia, and Washington not being happy about that. But what actually happened?
So Turkey has always been close to Russia as well, and that is what I was saying about its strategic place geopolitically. Erdogan is one of the few world leaders who speaks to Putin and Zelensky and the Europeans and America. So Turkey got an S-400 Russian anti-missile shield in 2019, which, as the second largest member of NATO, is not a great look. And the Europeans were furious, and the rest of NATO was furious. And there were calls to expel Turkey, and there were sanctions that were put on Turkey in Congress.
We have made very clear to the Turkish government our desire to see them move away from the putting into full operationalization the S-400 weapon system.
Potentially there are security risks and vulnerabilities about having Russian hardware of that kind of level on your territory that is potentially controlled from Russia as well.
Okay, so Erdogan strikes a missile deal with Russia, which kind of suggests that Turkey is moving closer to Russia. That becomes particularly visible then when the war in Ukraine starts in 2022. What was Erdogan's position when Russia first invaded Ukraine? Because, he's threading quite a small needle with a big thread here.
Yeah, and also remember that when Russia took over Crimea, I was in Crimea for that whole takeover, actually. Crimea was also important to Turkey because it's got ethnic Turks there. So Turkey was very, very quick in condemning that. In terms of the invasion, the re-invasion, I suppose, in the east and the war, Turkey has condemned it, but not to the point of freezing relations with Moscow. They are still absolutely communicating, and the Ukraine talks so far between Ukraine and Russia have been held in Istanbul. Many of them haven't achieved very much yet, but Erdogan still speaks to Putin, and they've met several times, but there are more people now in Russia, I gather, and more opinion pieces saying, don't go and spend your rubles on Turkish beaches because you are funding Turkish drones being used by the Ukrainians.
Bayraktar drones. I remember those.
So it's a tricky one because Russia needs Turkey, Turkey needs Russia. But, you can't be friends with everybody, I think. And, a war, in the war in Ukraine, clearly, I think that there's pressure on Turkey to choose sides.
Yeah, he's obviously quite skilled at the tightrope walking. As we discussed a little bit earlier on, Turkey's a pretty committed member of NATO. Donald Trump potentially is less so, particularly since he's returned to the White House in 2025. There's a lot of speculation about whether US membership of NATO might be under threat. What's the role that Erdogan might be playing in keeping the United States inside the alliance?
I mean, I don't know how unwilling Trump was to come to a NATO summit. He was at the Hague summit last year. He probably would have come this year. Who knows? Even if it had not been in Turkey, I think Erdogan wanted Trump to come because it would be the first visit by a US president to Turkey since 2015. And as we said earlier, a lot of what Erdogan wants is recognition, to be treated as an equal on the world stage. He always says this thing. One of his big slogans is "The world is bigger than five," meaning the five permanent members of the UN Security Council. He rails against the fact that the UN has got these five NATO-wielding members and no Islamic country is one of them. He thinks Turkey should be one of them. And so in many ways, just to sidetrack slightly, one of Erdogan's huge successes is that he has been seen, and he sees himself, I think, as the leader of the Muslim world. And to be honest, Tristan, when you see, whenever he's re-elected or defeated the coup or whatever, I mean, leaders from Pakistan to Brunei to Albania, they're all there because he's this kind of rallying point for the Islamic world. And so, being seen very much, hobnobbing with Trump, it elevates his country, elevates Islam, it elevates Turkish identity and everybody who is with Turkey on that.
Donald Trump is coming with his suitcase to Ankara in the hopes of a deal. But what could that deal actually look like?
It looks like the US has approved $700 million worth of defense equipment sales to Turkey, including engines for F-35 fighter jets, American-made F-35s. That was all held up because of the row over Turkey buying the Russian anti-missile system back in 2019, but it's now been approved, and it looks like actually Turkey might be getting F-35s themselves from the US.
Okay, I mean, $700 million in the great scheme of things seems like a relatively small amount of money, but I guess it's symbolic of bygones being bygones between NATO and Turkey.
Yeah, I think that it's more about the symbolism of those F-35s.
Yeah,
that were really that was such a sticking point, and that's been resolved. And the other interesting thing is that as far as Europe's concerned, the waning commitment or less than firm commitment of the US to NATO is meaning that Europe actually is depending more on Turkey, because Europe needs more strategic autonomy, as they call it, and they need a defense industry in Turkey that is booming. So the criticism of Turkey is fading actually by European leaders who realize they need Turkey with the vacuum of America. So the net beneficiary of what Trump is doing with NATO is Turkey.
So God forbid from the European perspective, but if there ever were a war with Russia, you wouldn't want to face that without Turkey as your ally beside you.
Absolutely. Military might, huge global significance, and also the one guy who Putin still kind of will pick up the phone to quite regularly.
NATO is in such a precarious position right now, we all know that. Could Erdogan be a vital ally for someone like Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, in keeping the alliance together because Turkey is so strong, because Erdogan has such an important relationship with Trump?
Yeah, I don't know what the Turkish for daddy is, but maybe Mark Rutte will have to look in his Turkish dictionary before he speaks to President Erdogan. But, Turkey, Turkey central to NATO, always has been, ever more so now. And with the alliance looking shaky in many ways, they need someone who is committed to it. And so, also it plays to NATO that that the summit is being held not in Paris, not in Warsaw, but in Ankara, just a few hundred miles away from Iran and Syria and and a couple of thousand miles away from Russia. But this is what NATO is about. That's the optics of it, and Erdogan loves it.
And it's a huge moment of pride for Turkey having NATO back for a summit on its soil. There hasn't been one since 2004. But you have all these other NATO leaders. What do they have to say about the state of backsliding of democratic rights in Turkey as they land there?
Not very much, to be honest. These were the ones who were criticizing and slamming the state of Turkish democracy just a couple of years ago, and it's gone quiet because, as we said, without the US being committed to NATO, who else are you going to rely on? And I think, in the grand scheme of things, you'd have to say, in the battle between Europe and Turkey for democracy, Turkey hasn't won on the democratic level, but I think it's won on the kind of who's stronger level, because the criticism of him has largely fallen silent, and he is still in power.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
This is great.
Lovely to talk to you.
That was BBC presenter and correspondent Mark Lowen. And that's it for this episode of The Global Story. We're also an audio podcast. You can find us on bbc.com or wherever you listen. See you next time. Cheerio.